Hello, Acts parents. I'm here again to give you a quick summary of some of the things we've been discussing in Acts class with your students. And I wanted to give just a quick rundown of Acts chapter 7. Truly one of my favorite chapters in the book of Acts, and hopefully it'll have one key truth that will impact you. So Acts chapter 7 is the recording of Stephen's speech. So Stephen was a Hellenistic Jew, which means he was heavily influenced by Greek culture. He probably grew up outside of Israel. He would have spoken Greek. He would have dressed in Greek clothing. And this group of Jews, the Hellenistic Jews, who have become a part of the church in Jerusalem, were having some tension with the non-Hellenistic Jews. These were the Jews that were born and raised in Israel, read the Old Testament only in Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic. And so there was this tension between this cultural gap between the Hellenistic Jews and the Hebraic Jews, or the Semitic Jews. To solve this problem had arisen where the Hellenistic widows were being overlooked for food. And so the church decides, let's appoint 7 men who will make sure that these widows gets their food. And so Stephen is one of those men. Well, Stephen doesn't only help widows get their food, which is something that is obviously important. But he also shares his faith everywhere he goes. And so he goes to the synagogue and he shares his faith and tells the Jews there about Jesus Christ, and the Jews begin to argue with Stephen. And they are going to do to Stephen exactly what they did to Jesus. They're going to accuse him of a crime he did not commit, and they're going to arrest him and have him on trial for a crime that could, and we'll see will, cost him his life. So Stephen is on trial, doing nothing wrong, and he is accused of blaspheming against the law of Moses and against the temple. And so he is accused of misusing or blaspheming against this holy place of God where the Israelites believe God dwelled. So their mindset in the first century was that God lived in the temple in Israel, and really nowhere else. Now, they knew that God was everywhere, but they had really kind of taken this idea that God's presence had compartmentalized into the temple. And they had that as a source of national pride. In their mind, God lives with us, and he doesn't live with anyone else. God doesn't live with the Gentiles, he lives with the Jews. And if you want to worship God, you got to come here. And so that was their mindset. Well, they accused Stephen of blaspheming against the temple. And so Stephen, in his speech, is going to do this crazy thing. He's not only going to show them how he's innocent, but he's going to accuse the very people in the courtroom of being guilty of the same crime. And so he's going to literally turn the tables on the audience. They're there to accuse Stephen of a crime, and Stephen's going to say, you're the ones who are guilty of the crime. So Stephen is going to use the history of Israel, starting with Abraham, running all the way past King David, to show the Jews in the room that they have a misunderstanding of what God's will was when it came to where his worship should be happening. Well, in their mindset, they viewed the temple as the only place God dwelled. And so what we're going to find is they had turned the temple into an idol. Now, when you hear the word idol, you might think of a statue that has engravings or some pole that people would worship at and make sacrifices to. And there's an element of truth to that. But when I hear the word idol, I think of that idea of a graven image, right? When you read the 10 Commandments back in Exodus 20, the second commandment is, thou shalt not make a graven image of anything above the earth or below the earth or anything on the earth. You shouldn't make an image of God. See, the first commandment is thou shalt have no other gods before me. And the second commandment, most of the time when I talk to students, they think, well, idols means don't have any other gods before me. And so did God repeat himself? Did he make the first 2 commandments say the same thing? And I would argue no. I think there was something fundamentally flawed with the idea of making an image, a physical structure that represented God. And so the Israelites had turned the temple into an idol. And here's what idolatry was. It was, I can only worship God here. I can only worship God at the temple. I can only worship God where there is a statue of God. I don't think the people in the ancient world thought they were worshiping a tree. The tree was a conduit to access God. They weren't worshiping some golden statue. They were worshiping the God it connected them to. Well, that created a dangerous mindset that I can only worship God here and not here, because God is only accessible here and not here. And what it does is it divides the world into spiritual and secular. Here I can worship God, and here God hears me, and here God listens to me, and here I can't worship him, nor does he really care what I'm doing or what I'm saying. And so that was the Israelite mindset. It was, if I'm at the temple, God cares, God hears me, I can worship God, and if I'm not at the temple, I can't. Well, in this account of Israel's history, Stephen is going to say things like, God met Abraham in Mesopotamia. not in Israel, not in a building, but where Abraham was. And then he's going to fast forward and talk about how Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, but it says, but God was with him in Egypt, right? So God isn't stuck in some building. He's not in some temple or structure. He is with Abraham in Mesopotamia. He is with Joseph in Egypt. And then it goes on to say that God appeared to Moses in the burning bush in the wilderness, right? And he says, this is holy ground. And so what Stephen's going to do in his speech is he's going to demonstrate, Israelites, if you think that God is only worshipable here and not here, you are violating the second commandment. And then he brings up the story of the golden calf and says this is the very same thing the Israelites did. They said, let's worship God in a physical structure. Let's build an idol. Let's build a calf to be our representation of God. And God is furious with this decision. And just to highlight this point one more time, this is what Stephen brings up in his speech. God told them to build a tabernacle, not a building. And the difference between a tabernacle, which is a tent, and a building, a tabernacle or a tent is mobile. So you can be packed up and brought wherever God and his people are. Whereas a building is a stuck structure that cannot move. And so God wanted the Israelites to build something that could move because he wants to tell the Israelites this: I am wherever my people are. And that's what we see in the Old Testament. When God meets Abraham in Mesopotamia, when God is with Joseph in Egypt, when God is with Moses in the burning bush, God is wherever his people are. And so when Stephen brings this up in his speech, he's making a point, whether you see it or not. He's making the point that you think that God is in that temple. Trust me, he's not there. God has left that place. God is where his people are, and his people aren't in that building right now. They're with the church. So down the street, that's where God is. God is with his people. He's not stuck in some building where we have to go to the building to access him. And so this is why he then turns at the end of his speech and says to the Israelites, you stiff-necked people with uncircumcised hearts and ears, has there ever been a prophet your people did not persecute, and then you killed the very one they spoke of, the Messiah that was to come? And you, even though you were given the law first by the angels, have not followed it, because they took the temple and turned it into an idol. And then he quotes Isaiah in his speech. At the end of his speech, he says, where are you going to build a house for me? He says, the heavens are my dwelling place, and the earth is my footstool. Can you build a building out of stuff on this earth when I made the earth that would hold me? Of course not. And so he's trying to make this point that God is wherever his people are. And ironically, the Jewish people who think God's in the temple, he's not there. All right, so I talked about this with our students, and I want to highlight this application for you. Where do we do this? Well, every time that we decide that God is here and not here, we're making an idol of the places we think God is. So if I think I can only worship God on Sunday morning at my church, then you have turned your church into an idol. I tell the students, if you think you can only worship God in Bible class, you are turning Bible class into an idol and ignoring how you can worship God in history class or English or math or on the football field or in a fine arts performance. You can honor God in all those places. And when we say God is only here but not here, we are creating an idol of the places we are saying God is. I see we do this all the time with things like music. We say things like, I can't worship God to this style of music. Well, you should be able to worship God no matter what music is playing. And so what happens is you're turning the music you prefer into an idol. I say the same kind of things with like translations of Scripture. Well, it's only real worship of God if it's this translation. Now, not that we want to have a false translation. Don't get me wrong. There's an idea of being unbiblical. But when it comes to things like which translation is best, if I say only this one is of God, then what I'm doing is I'm creating a problem where that translation is an idol, especially since the New Testament was written in Greek anyway, and a lot of the things we're arguing about aren't in Greek. And so all I want to do is highlight this for you and for your students. You can have a conversation with them about this. Do we recognize that God is wherever his people are? Do we recognize that we can worship God at all times and all places, no matter what our background, no matter where we're located, no matter what we're doing? Are we worshiping God everywhere, or are we compartmentalizing our lives and only worship God in places that make sense or that are most convenient or where we prefer, and ignoring God in the areas that we've now deemed secular? So I hope that encourages you. And Stephen paid the ultimate price for preaching this message, and of course we know we will see him again on the other side of this life in heaven with the Lord. But I'm glad that we have this speech recorded so we can be challenged to recognize, where can we worship God? Everywhere, because God is wherever his people are. Thank you so much for watching.